Poems to a Listener, readings and conversation with contemporary poets.
Between this and that other country is neither barricade nor sentry. Plausible under elm and maple, past the train window, move the people. No foreign air in face or clothing. Nothing to warn me, nothing. No signboard's word to tell me whether this is one country or the other.
Welcome to Poems to a Listener. I'm Henry Lyman, and in this half-hour program, we'll be visiting with poet Constance Carrier and listening to poems drawn mostly from her book, The Angled Road, published by The Swallow Press. In the passage we just heard, we see her arriving by train in a town, a city, as though she were coming from another country.
Well, I am arriving at the known, the everyday, the prosaic, the wherewithal of my life on one level.
Here in New Britain.
Here in New Britain. The place where I was born, grew up, earned my living, spent my life. The tides around the square. Time like a sea has ebbed and flowed upon this inland littoral, under the elm trees' widening arc, leaving at each high water mark sea wrack or driftwood, weed or shell, to show the margins of the flood. Past houses left from 1810, time like a sea has ebbed and flowed. To guess their story is to trace the lost elm from its withering leaf. Where once the apple orchard stood, 50 years later, wealthier men built high, dark-browed Victorian homes that faced the square as they still face, to show the margins of the flood with a strange, rigid, heavy grace. The fountain scrap iron now, the lawn shrunk to a patch, the stables gone. Another tide is rising here. Around the corner, inch by inch, has crept the undertow of town. Time like a sea has ebbed and flowed. The elm trees shudder root and branch. The current laps around the square. The mansard roofs look coldly down on filling station, grocery store, diner, photographer's supplies. The imperceptible waters rise to show the margins of the flood. The town is growing. Trade is good. And twice a day a wave is flung and withdrawn along the square, breaking upon the schoolyard shore, the froth and ripple of the young, surging along the channels where a time like a sea has ebbed and flowed. Their only epoch is their own. They are compounded of that wave, its lime and salt, their bone and blood. They move too swiftly to perceive tides, or to care what theirs may leave to show the margins of the flood.
The young school children, as they emerge twice a day from the school at recess, seem completely oblivious.
I think that's very true of not just that particular generation, but every generation. The curious thing is how much they'll find was imprinted on their memories without their volition at all, or their recognition.
By the place itself.
By the place. I know that's happened to me. I can go back in my head now and see the street as it was when I had been one of the troop of children. I can see the houses, I can see the trees, I can see the whole pattern.
Those Victorian houses.
Oh, they were marvelous. They really were.
But they're mostly gone now.
Oh, I wept. They went, I know. But they're here in my head, at least.
The poem refers to New Britain fundamentally as an inland littoral. How do you mean that?
Well, a littoral isn't it a beachhead?
Mm-hmm.
I guess I was thinking of it as a place where things pile up, as they do on a beachhead, as the tides come and go. Commencement. Through elm and maple and syringa branches, the almost summer sunlight fills the air. So bright itself, it blurs, it rims with brilliance, all Franklin Square. The school's a tabernacle, gilded, holy, half seen through the long tunnel of the trees. The light, like honey, warm and melting, covers our indolent ease. Half seen, a valedictory group of schoolgirls. Upon them, casual shadow, casual light, falling like prophecy, like revelation. Bewildering sight in the moment before the moment of perception. So we must turn, our eyelids heavy with sun, to look at them, potential, undetermined, until one moves away from the others with no backward turning or glance, moves from the checkered shade into the light, so swiftly, singly, surely, we are almost afraid to take our eyes from her, from the self, emerging here on a May Day noon in the Golden Square. And the other figures, when we look behind her, vanished in air.
This is a very special moment in a person's life.
Yes, I think so. And as I watched her grow older, it seemed that what she was becoming had its roots in this particular moment.
You must have seen this when you were teaching her. She was one of your
Yeah,
students?
she was in one of my classes.
Latin classes.
Yeah. And she was very shy and had a great capacity, but not much realization of it. And I had been afraid that her shyness might prevent her from ever attaining it. But I was quite wrong, and I'm very happy that I was.
What became of her?
Well, she became herself. She went to college, and she majored in Latin, and she married several years later, and they moved to California, and she raised a small family out there, and then she died very young.
Oh.
But she is still so alive to me. I can almost see her, hear her voice. And she had, I suppose, in one sense, a fairly narrow life. But she loved reading, she loved Latin, she loved the family, and somehow all of those things came together. And I think her life was a full and happy one. I'd like to, anyway. Peter at 14. What do you care for Caesar, who yourself are in 3 parts divided, and must find past daydream and rebellion and bravado, the final shape and substance of your mind? What are the Belgae, the Helvetii to you? I doubt that you will read in them metaphor of your stand against dominion, or see as yours their desperate stratagem. They found their tribal rank, their feuds, their freedom, obliterated, lost beyond return. It took them years to see that law and order could teach them things that they might care to learn. as fiercely individual, as violent as they, you clutch your values and your views, fearful that self may not survive absorption. Who said to learn at first is like to lose? Not courage, no, but nature will betray you. You will stop fighting finally, and your pride that fed so long upon your independence flourish on what convention can provide, till you may grow more Roman than the Romans, contemptuous of pagan broils and brawls, and even, mastering your mentor's knowledge, go on to build cathedrals like the Gauls.
Peter was also one of your students.
Yes, and he hated me, he abominated Latin.
And he hated Caesar.
And he loathed Caesar. But there he was, and I had to force feed him, so to speak.
He's a very independent spirit.
Oh, he was. But gradually all that settled down into a pattern, and he became an excellent citizen.
Yes.
Pretty solid, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, convention is what he takes on.
Convention is what bound him in, I guess, really. But a lot of our convention is descended from Roman standards, so in a way, he has Caesar to blame if he's unhappy now. Fugue. Behind the granite church, the sky has taken on the quality of stone, its weight, its triple tone from gray to purple hue. Pigeons dip and wheel, purple, slate gray, and blue. Purple, slate blue, and gray, the shadows blend and shift. The shadows load and darken the late December day, darken and fade and lift, resume and fade, a chord that swells and dies away, that dies away and swells, against whose dominant the birds in spiral flight go up across the stone, up like the sound of bells, then, like the overtones, drift downward past the stone. Pigeons and cloud and church resolve their medley toward both counterpoint and chord. The sullen, troubled, slow clouds moved against their will, the church a silent no to motion, and the birds nervous arpeggio. Perceive, O innocent, here in this triad plain, dead calm and flying storm, and motion grave and slow, the ancient argument of bone and blood and brain, whose tones, though they remain antiphonal, afford both counterpoint and chord.
You saw this. You perceived this.
It was part of my day every week, 5 days a week. After school, I would go to the diner on the square and have a reviving cup of coffee and stare out into the landscape, which consisted across the square of this particular church. And the triple things kept growing on me, the three shades of color and the
gray
piece.
clouds moving
clouds,
behind the church,
right?
and the pigeons spiraling
and the pigeons
up
spiraling
around the steeple
up and
back
down.
down again.
Yes, and as I looked, I began to feel this chord that they were making. But whether it comes out in the words, I don't know. I can only hope. Urban renewal. Today, the wrecker's ball serves time as a pendulum, explodes the brick to dust, brings down the buckling wall. We see, if we see at all, how here and there storefronts, no longer a solid row, but naked at rear and side, have swallowed all but the L of some high Italianate house from another century, or how there has survived a single warped gray tree, apple perhaps, and once part of an orchard here, rooted in rubble now, mysteriously long-lived, astonished at light and air in this laid-bare scurf of slum. In a year or two, there will rise new buildings, new young trees, small, careful patches of grass to pattern the gray concrete. But now we can be aware for the space of a heartbeat of the past being peeled away like paper peeled from a wall, patterns fragile as glass on each ragged, half-rotten layer for the idle mind to trace. Time culled, all things become themselves a part of time, discarded and denied. Whatever they had of grace endows us none the less. What is and what will be in a single continuum with this and all that has died, too, is defined by from.
Urban renewal. New Britain has experienced that. With what result?
Now, 10, 20 years later, with some regret for what went down because it was unfashionable.
The past
The past, right.
was destroyed to a great extent.
A large extent of it.
But you know, the poem suggests to me that the past really cannot be destroyed. As the buildings are disintegrated, they become themselves a part of time, so the poem says.
Oh, this is very, very true.
Do you mean that the
awful.
past continues?
The past continues, I think, in what it breeds.
In how it affects us?
And how it affects us, right.
And yet we have a tendency to deny this, to deny the past,
Oh, yes,
discard
and we feel that we are the fresh, new, vigorous, we're going to cut off all the things that would bind us to the past, and we're going to step up and
all
be
the ties.
new.
Right.
I suppose every generation has said it since there were generations. Pro Patria. On a green island in the main street, traffic is a granite arch to the dead of the Civil War, in the East Lake style, all cubes and tetrahedrons, each end of the passage barred by an ironclad door. They are always locked, though the space between is empty. From door to door, it isn't much over a yard. Break open one, you could almost touch the other. Nobody knows what the locks were meant to guard. East and west, the head of a blank-eyed lion hisses an arc of spray to the pool below with a faint, persistent sound, an endless whisper, steady under the traffic's stop and go. On top of the monument stands a gilded lady, casting a wreath forever into space. Her carven robes are decent and concealing. There is no emotion graven on her face. Words are cut in the stone above the arches. They joined the mortal struggle and went down. And on every coin is written the name of a battle that bloodied creek or landing, bluff or town, now hard and dry in history and granite. In summer, the sun lies hot upon the stone, and the bums and the drunks and the old men and the pigeons take over the little island for their own. The old men sit on a bench with nuts and bread crusts for the birds to eat from their hands. The ne'er-do-wells sprawl on the grass and drowse and boast and argue. The drunks discourse like statesmen and oracles, while the birds skim over their heads with a cardboard clatter of wings, or mince on the pavement at their feet. They are, all of them, tolerant of one another, in this world like a bubble, this island in the street. The sun is warm, the lions hiss, and the faithful loaf in their places, lazy and benign, a little hierarchy who inherit this plot of earth, this obsolescent shrine. Who can recall the day of that war's ending? Think of our own time then, the summer night when the word came, and all the church bells sounded the end of the dark and the coming of the light. How many times, how many towns have seen it, the light, the hope, the promise, after the dark, seen it and watched it flicker and ebb and vanish, leaving no trace except some little park where no one recalls that dream, that disillusion, and a monument to death is only known as a place where the harmless, unambitious gather, and the doves come down for bread on the sun-warmed stone.
This war memorial on Main Street seems so utterly obsolete.
Oh, there are still benches around and people do sit there, but I must say that the bums and the drunks and the old men are no longer visible to any great degree.
That's kind of sad.
In a sense, because they had a flavor of their own in a certain sense.
They seem almost a little closer to the real meaning of the war memorial
Oh, I think so.
than the rest of us.
To them, it was a place to gather, it was like a home, I suppose.
But nobody else seems to know why it's really there. Why is it that we keep forgetting? Why is it that we keep forgetting that?
I don't know. We know that it's a memorial to the Civil War, but why it's locked? Oh, I've peered through it with my nose against the iron lace, and I can see rows and rows and rows of names carved on the inner walls. I suppose the people who fought in the war from here, but you can't tell them, you can't see them, you can't get any feeling for them.
What does it really stand for you, in your mind, in the poem, ultimately?
The memorial, you mean?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the fact that there was a pause long enough for people to raise a memorial and almost feel as though this was the final war. And then, of course, in 20 years, 40 years, you go through it again. But I don't know. The prospect before us. Someone on Walnut Hill has taken a picture, reducing the town by distance to design, under an arch of sky whose empty vastness the ample clouds can only underline. All that is left of landscape lies at the bottom of a sea of summer air. The town is drowned under that sky, remote above the buildings that in the picture scarcely clear the ground. Yet when we look at it, our gaze goes downward to the landscape under those intangible seas. We are intent to mark the South Church steeple, or the railroad station, or one of the factories, Willowbrook Park, or the highway off to Boston. We are restless always until we identify what we have known from another plane and angle. A curious agitation drives the eye to furnish the ego at once with reassurance, establish bearings, prove our knowledge, find, here in a scene grown suddenly unfamiliar, some foothold for the orphaned, anxious mind. We must touch the earth, must seek immortal solace, must find ourselves, our own, our known in the crowd, before we can face the old inhuman spaces above, before we can turn toward sky and cloud.
The poem contemplates the town from the distance of a photograph, which has been taken from a hill.
I watched people looking at it, and I noticed that they did this, that instead of sort of being on that height with the photographer, they had to look down at once.
Into the town.
Into the town, and oh, there's this, and oh, I see that over there, and this is the library, this is the South Church, this is something. Then they could sort of let their gaze go out beyond the limits to the horizon and the expanse of
Sky and cloud.
and atmosphere. And
which you call those old, inhuman spaces.
well, they are.
Is there a danger, do you think, then, in remaining too much in those inhuman spaces?
Well, I think you lose touch with your reality. I mean, the atmosphere in which you live and the air in which you breathe is down at the bottom there. Your life is down there.
And we're compelled to go back there.
I think so. Or at least not to lose touch with it.
To find ourselves in the crowd,
Yes, I think
in
so.
the others.
Because otherwise you dehumanize yourself, which is not, I think, one's aim. You need some of both. Journey. Between this and that other country is neither barricade nor sentry. Plausible under elm and maple, past the train window move the people. No foreign air in face or clothing, nothing to warn me, nothing, nothing. No signboard's word to tell me whether this is one country or the other. Yet, once arrived, without confusion, I move expertly through the station. No stranger whom the traffic vexes, I can evade the trucks and taxis. Sure-footed sleepwalker, I saunter across the park, see without wonder the war memorial, the benches, familiar sun, familiar branches. I wait the proper bus, and waiting, hear my name called in sudden greeting, and find my own responses come apt in the local idiom.
We've been visiting with poet Constance Carrier and listening to poems drawn mostly from her book, The Angled Road, published by The Swallow Press. I'm Henry Lyman. Thanks for being with us.
Poems to a Listener was produced by Henry Lyman in cooperation with WFCR Amherst, Massachusetts. Financial assistance was provided by the Massachusetts Council on the Arts and Humanities, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the Massachusetts Foundation for Humanities and Public Policy.